Arizona Territory. 1879, the wind kicked dust across the cracked ground of Bisbee, as the sun beat down like it had a score to settle. Travis Holler had just stepped off his gelding outside the general store, boots heavy with trail dust, and his hat pulled low against the heat. He only meant to water his horse, grab a tin of coffee, and be on his way. Then he saw her. She stood near the well, holding the hand of a little boy who could not have been older than 5. Her dress was torn at the hem, stained with dirt and sun bleached to a dull brown. Her shoulders were squared like she meant to look strong, but her eyes were rimmed with red, and her lips pressed together like she was swallowing something sharp. Travis knew hardship when he saw it. He had buried both parents before he turned 17, worked cattle from Texas to Colorado, and fought men twice his size for less reason than he had now. But nothing had planted his boots to the earth like the sight of her. The boy tugged on her skirt. "Mama, I'm thirsty." She knelt beside him, her voice soft. "I know, Tobias, just a little longer, all right." Travis's chest tightened. He stepped forward, slow and steady, like approaching a spooked colt. "Ma'am, water's clean. Let me draw some for you." She looked up, startled. Her eyes were the color of river stone, and they flicked to his revolver, then back to his face. "We're not beggars. Never said you were." He reached for the well crank. "I'm offering. That's all." She hesitated, then gave a stiff nod. He filled an empty tin cup from his saddlebag and handed it to the boy first, who drank like he had been walking through the desert for days. Then he offered it to her. She took it without a word, and he noticed her fingers were scraped up, one knuckle bleeding. "I'm Travis Holler," he said. "You all right, ma'am?" The woman drew herself up. "Hattie Sullivan." Where she paused, glanced at Tobias. "We're passing through. He your boy?" he asked gently. She nodded once, jaw tight. "His father left us 2 towns back. Took the wagon, the money, and near everything else." Travis's gut twisted. "I'm sorry." "I ain't," she said, voice flat. "He never raised a hand to help, only to hurt." Travis looked at the boy, who was now sitting in the shade of the general store porch, clutching the tin cup to his chest. Then he looked back at her. "Where were you headed?" "Anywhere but back," she whispered. He glanced at her dress again, torn, held together by uneven stitches, like she had sewn it in the dark. Then he reached into the small leather pouch tied to his belt. He had carried the ring around for years. Not for a woman he had ever known, but for the hope that one day he would find her. He held out his hand. "You got nothing. No wagon, no food, no one watching your back. That's no way for a woman and her son to live." "I did not ask you for anything," she said, eyes flaring. "I know," he said simply. Then he dropped the ring into her palm. "You're mine now." She stared at it like it was a snake. "I do not mean owned," he added. "I mean protected, safe, fed. You want me to ride on, I will, but if you let me, I'll take you both home. I run a cattle spread about 2 hours west. Got work, got space, and I got no wife." She looked down at the ring. It was plain silver, a little tarnished, but it fit her palm like it belonged there. "You do not know me," she whispered. "I know enough. You stayed strong for your boy. You did not beg. You stitched that dress with your own hands. That tells me all I need." Her voice broke. "I do not want pity." "This ain't pity," he said. "This is a man knowing what he wants when he sees it." Tobias trotted back over, his bare feet kicking up dust, and looked up at Travis. "Are you a cowboy?" "I am," Travis said with a small smile. "You got cows?" "Plenty." Tobias turned to his mother. "Mama, can we go with him, please?" Hattie swallowed hard. She looked up at Travis, eyes wide and uncertain. "You sure about this?" He nodded. "I am." She closed her fingers around the ring with a shaky breath. "All right." Travis exhaled like he had been holding his breath for years. He reached out, not to grab her, but to steady her arm as she stepped toward his horse. "You ride," he said. "I'll walk." "I can walk too," she said quickly. "You will not." Not today. His voice was gentle but firm. You're mine now. She blinked, then nodded. Travis lifted her up onto the saddle, then Tobias, and tied his supplies tight. As they rode west, the sun dipped low behind them, casting orange light across the scrubland. They did not talk much, but when her fingers brushed his on the reins, she did not pull away. By the time the ranch house came into view, a modest place with cedar shutters and a porch that needed mending, Tobias was asleep against her shoulder. Travis helped her down, then carried the boy inside, laid him on the bed in the extra room. You can have my room, he said. I'll take the floor, she shook her head. No, we are not staying long. He looked at her, steady and sure. Yes, you are. She looked around the room, simple, clean, a single flower pressed between glass on the nightstand. Her eyes landed on the ring in her palm again. You are not afraid I will run? I would not stop you if you did, he said, but I do not think you will. She stood in the doorway a long moment, her arms wrapped around herself. Then she stepped forward, laid the ring gently on the nightstand, and whispered, Do not sleep on the floor. Travis straightened just slightly. You sure? She looked up at him, eyes soft now, not guarded. You said I was yours. He stepped close. You still got time to change your mind. I do not want to. He reached for her hand then, slowly, and this time she did not pull away. Her fingers curled into his, and he felt her breath catch. Outside, the desert wind howled low, but inside, the night was quiet. And for the first time in weeks, Hattie Sullivan closed her eyes and felt safe. By morning, the wind had settled and the sky ran soft with pale pinks and gold, like the land itself was exhaling after too long held tight. Hattie stirred awake to the scent of wood smoke and coffee, her body heavy with a kind of rest she hadn't known in years. The boy was still sleeping, curled beneath a quilt so worn at the edges it spoke of long use, but clean all the same. She sat up slow, her muscles sore from days on foot and the weight of worry she'd carried like a stone. The room was plain, a pine dresser, a nailed-together bookshelf with no books, a single coat hook hung crooked on the far wall. But it was quiet. No shouting, no dread waiting at the door. When she stepped into the main room, Travis was at the stove, his shirt sleeves rolled above the elbow, frying something that sizzled faintly in the pan. He glanced over once, then turned back to his work. There's cornbread left from last night, he said. And eggs if you're set on staying upright. Hattie crossed her arms, unsure what to do with herself. I don't expect you to cook for me. I don't much care who expects what, he said, not unkindly. Just figured you'd want something warm before the day starts. I'm not used to folks thinking about what I want, she said, voice lower than she meant. He slid the eggs onto a tin plate and set it on the table. Then it's time that changed. She sat down across from him, wary, fingers brushing the edge of the plate. The eggs were overcooked by a minute, edges browned, but they smelled good. She hadn't had eggs in weeks. He poured her a cup of coffee and filled his own, then sat opposite her without saying more. They ate in silence, the kind that didn't press or demand, just made room. Dust motes spun in the light coming through the window, and somewhere outside, a hen clucked low and steady. Finally, she looked up. You live out here alone. For near 3 years now, Travis said. Had a partner for a while. He took off up to Flagstaff when the silver rush started. Left me the land and half a barn full of tools I ain't got time to use. You always planned to marry? She asked, surprising herself. He didn't blink. Didn't think on it much. Figured if the right woman crossed my path, I'd know. She studied him. He looked younger in the morning light, though his eyes still carried the weight of someone who never learned the luxury of ease. His hands were calloused, wrists sun-darkened, and there was a pale scar running along his jaw she hadn't noticed before. I ain't the right woman, she said. "You're the one standing in my kitchen," he said simply. "And you didn't run when you had the chance." She looked down at her plate. "Running takes strength. I used most of mine just getting here." He leaned back in his chair, coffee cradled in both hands. "That boy of yours. He ever had a place to learn letters. Tobias knows his name and not much else," she said. "We never stayed nowhere long. Got a slate board in the shed," he said. "And some books from my ma. Weren't much of a teacher, but she tried." Hattie's brow furrowed. "You think on things more than you say, don't you?" "I speak when I've got something that needs saying," he said. "Most men talk to fill space. I don't like wasting words." She nodded slowly. "You make it hard to argue with you." Travis stood then, rinsed the tin plates in the basin. "I'll show you the barn after you check on the boy. Ain't much, but it keeps the sun off." She hesitated. "You want me to help?" "I want you to know this place is yours if you choose it," he said. "That means more than sleeping in a bed. You get to walk the land, know the fences, feed the hens if you like. Or don't. No one's keeping score." She didn't answer, but followed him out once she'd woken Tobias and wrapped a shawl around her shoulders. The boy took Travis's hand without prompting. Small fingers curled around two of his, and Hattie watched in quiet surprise as they crossed the yard together. The barn leaned slightly westward, its sides weathered silver gray, but the roof held strong and the stalls were swept clean. A pair of mares stood in the back paddock, tails flicking lazily at flies. Travis opened the gate and let Tobias run ahead into the hay. "Built this myself," he said. "One board at a time." She ran her hand along a beam. "You did it right." He turned to her then, not smiling but steady. "I won't rush you, but I meant what I said yesterday. You're mine now if you want to be." She met his gaze. "And if I don't, I'll still feed you, still see that boy's looked after, but I'll wait, quietly." She took a breath, the air thick with hay and morning light. "I ain't ready to wear your name." "I didn't ask you to yet," he said, "but I'll stay," she said. "I'll help where I can, and I want Tobias to learn," he nodded. "That's enough." They stood in the barn doorway watching the boy tumble in the straw. Her fingers brushed the edge of the shawl and his hand found the doorframe beside hers, not touching, but close. The day stretched ahead, warm and open. For the first time in her life, she didn't feel like she had to run. 3 weeks passed, and the days softened. Mornings began with the creak of the porch step under Travis's boots and the scrape of a chair as he left it out for her beside his. He never said much while they drank their coffee, just sat with her while the sun climbed slow over the hills. Tobias would be in the yard by then, chasing chickens or trailing after the ranch dog, a brindle mutt named Patch who had taken to the boy like they'd been born on the same day. Hattie had started mending things, shirts with torn cuffs, a saddle blanket unraveling at the edge, even a pair of trousers Travis had nearly thrown out. She didn't ask permission. She just did, and he let her. One afternoon, while the heat held still over the land and the flies buzzed slow in the rafters, Travis leaned on the fence near the west pasture, watching her lead a mare toward the trough. "You handle stock like you've done it before," he said. She didn't look up. "My uncle raised mules in Arkansas. I used to help him before I was married off. You ever want to go back there? There's no one left to go back to." She tied the mare's lead to a post and wiped her brow with the back of her hand. "I don't miss it," he nodded, chewing the inside of his cheek. "You ever ride proper, not side saddle, if that's what you mean?" "I didn't think you would." She turned to face him, eyes narrowing slightly. "You offering to lend me a horse, I'm offering to show you the North Ridge. You've been here long enough not to get turned around." "I'll need a rifle," she said. He raised his brows. "Expecting trouble. Just prefer not to be caught without one." He didn't argue. She was already walking back toward the barn, her boots kicking up little puffs of dust. He followed, and by the time they rode out, Tobias was in the care of a neighbor woman who came by twice a week for washing work. The boy had barely looked up from his carving stick when Hattie kissed the top of his head and whispered something only he could hear. They rode single file at first, the trail narrow and cut with dry washouts. She handled the gelding he gave her like she was born in the saddle, her back straight, hands sure. He watched her from behind, not for the look of her, but for the way she moved with the land like it was something she understood. At the ridge, they dismounted. The valley stretched wide below, dotted with scrub and mesquite, the river cutting a lazy line through the far edge. They stood side by side, the wind tugging at her sleeves. "You built your home near good water," she said. "Cattle need it more than I do." She crouched, plucked a dry stem of grass and rolled it between her fingers. "You always wanted this life. I wanted something I could hold on to. Something no one could take." She didn't look at him when she answered. "I used to think marriage would be that." He waited. "But I didn't marry a man. I married a storm, one that never settled." Travis crouched beside her, resting his arms on his knees. "You think I'm different. I think you're steady. You think that's enough. I think it might be the only thing that is." They stayed there as the sun dropped low, casting long shadows over the ridge. He could have reached for her hand, but didn't. He let the silence stand between them, not as distance, but as something earned. When they rode back, she didn't lead the way. She rode beside him, closer than before. That night, long after Tobias had fallen asleep and the house had gone quiet, Hattie stood in the doorway to the porch, watching the stars. Travis was sitting on the steps, oiling the latch of an old rifle. He didn't turn when she stepped out. "I used to pray," she said softly. He set the cloth aside. "Still do?" "No, but tonight I almost did." He turned then, slow, careful. "What for?" She stepped down beside him, slipped her hand into his. "That you'd still be here when I was ready." He closed his fingers around hers, rough palm against her calloused one. "I've been here." She leaned her head against his shoulder. "I know." The stars burned bright above them, and the porch creaked beneath their weight, but neither spoke again. Not that night. They didn't need to. The house behind them stayed warm, and the wind passed gentle through the eaves. The cottonwoods along the creek had begun to leaf out, their bright green fluttering in the breeze like new promise. Days had warmed enough that laundry dried by noon, and the hens clucked longer into the evenings. Hattie had taken to walking the fence line after supper, Tobias trailing behind with a stick he used to poke at anthills and soft patches of mud. Travis watched them from the porch, one boot braced on the rail, mending a broken bridle strap. The leather was cracked where it folded near the buckle, sun damage more than misuse. He'd need to oil it twice over before it held right again. "You should have said something about the south fence," Hattie called, lifting Tobias onto the fence rail as she neared the house. "One of the corner posts is leaning. Couple more storms and it'll fall." "I was waiting for an extra pair of hands," he said. "Well, now you've got two," she replied, brushing dust from her skirt. He nodded toward the shed. "There's cedar rails behind the feed sacks. Might take a full morning." She didn't hesitate. "Then we'll start early." She went inside to wash up, and Travis followed her in after folding the bridal cloth. The boy had already settled at the table with a dull pencil and the last of the slate pieces. Hattie leaned over him, brushing his hair from his eyes, murmuring something low before lighting the stove. "You always talk quiet with him," Travis said. She didn't turn. "He hears enough noise from the world. He doesn't need it from me." "You ever wish you had more?" he asked. She looked over. "More what? Children?" She paused a moment. "I did, once." He waited. "But sometimes wantin' something don't make it so." She turned back to the firebox. "I bled too much during Tobias's birth. Doctor said not to expect more." Travis moved to the counter and poured water into the tin basin. "I'm sorry." "I'm not," she said, wiping her hands on a cloth. "He's here, that's enough." He tapped the edge of the basin with his knuckle. "You ever think about teaching to other children?" He nodded. She sat down across from the boy. "I used to, back before I was married off. Never finished my own schooling, though. Mama died before I got far, and Papa put me to work." "You read better than most men I know," Travis said. "And that boy of yours is already counting fence rails." She reached out and turned Tobias's slate so she could see the numbers. "He's got a good head. He's got a good mother." She met his eyes across the table. "You say things like that and expect me not to feel it. I expect you to know I mean it." The stove popped as the wood settled, and Tobias leaned against her side, his eyes heavy. She shifted just enough to cradle his head to her shoulder, her hand resting lightly on his back. "You ever sleep easy?" she asked softly. "Not until lately." "I'm still learning how," she admitted. "Then let me keep showing you." She didn't answer right away, just ran her fingers through Tobias's hair. After a while, she said, "I found the ring in your drawer this morning. Thought you might have taken it back." "I didn't." "I know, but I looked anyway." Travis pulled a chair beside her. "I'm not in a hurry, Hattie, but I'm not holding back, neither. If you want that ring, I'll put it on your hand proper. If not, it'll stay where it is." She watched him for a long moment, then whispered, "You'd marry me even if I never gave you another child." "I'd marry you if all you ever gave me was more mornings like this." Her breath caught, but she didn't turn away. "You're not a man who makes promises lightly." "No." "Then I'll give you my answer after we fix that fence." He nodded once. "That'll do." They sat like that until the embers dimmed and the boy's breathing deepened against her. Travis didn't reach for her hand and she didn't offer it. But the space between them had changed, like a door opened partway through. Outside, the night settled over the land with the hush of a cotton sheet being pulled across a bed. And inside, without speaking it aloud, they both knew they were already building something meant to last. The morning they set out to mend the south fence, the sky was low and gray, the kind of overcast that made the air smell of iron and distant rain. Travis hitched the wagon with cedar rails and a coil of wire, while Hattie packed a wrapped loaf of bread and a jar of leftover beans into a basket. Tobias, still rubbing sleep from his eyes, was handed off to Ruthie Cook, the neighbor woman, with a promise that he'd be home before supper. They rode out without much talk, the trail rutted and soft from a storm days before. The land sloped gently southward, where the fence meandered along a dry arroyo. A few of the posts leaned like tired men, and one had split clean through at the base. Travis handed her the post driver and she took it without a word, sleeves rolled to the elbow, hair twisted up beneath her hat. They worked without fuss. He dug the holes. She steadied the rails, their movements falling into rhythm like they'd done this side by side for years. Around midday, they paused beneath a chokecherry tree and shared the bread and beans, eating quiet, brushing crumbs from their laps, boots stretched toward the shade. "You ever miss being alone?" she asked, not looking at him. "No," he said and meant it. She nodded, chewing slow. "I think I used to believe I was built to be alone, safer that way. You ain't alone now." She turned her face toward the wind, eyes tracking a hawk overhead. "You know, when I was a girl, I used to watch the older women hanging laundry and wonder which ones were happy. Not just settled, but real content. Figure it out." She looked back at him. "The ones who didn't flinch when their husbands came home, that's who I wanted to be." His jaw tightened, but he didn't speak. "I never thought I'd get to be her," she said. "But lately, I don't flinch anymore." Travis reached for her hand, warm and rough with work. "I'll never give you reason to." She didn't pull away. "I know." They finished the repair by late afternoon. The sun dropped low behind a bank of cloud, and the wind picked up just enough to carry the scent of juniper from the ridge. Travis leaned against the last post they'd set, wiping sweat from his brow. "You remember what you said," she said suddenly, "about marrying me if I wanted that ring." He straightened, watching her carefully. "I do." "Well," she said, stepping closer, "I want it." He didn't speak right away. He reached into his coat pocket and drew out the silver ring, the one she'd left on the nightstand weeks ago. He didn't ask again. He just offered it, open in his palm. She took it and slid it onto her own finger, no ceremony, no speech. When her hand returned to his, it was steady. "You sure?" he asked, voice low. "I've never been more sure of anything," she said. "But I don't want fancy, I want clean and simple, just you, me, and Tobias. That's all I ever wanted too." They rode home in the hush of a sky heavy with dusk. Ruthie had supper waiting when they arrived, and Tobias ran out barefoot to greet them, his cheeks smudged with flour from helping knead dough. "Mama," he said, "Ruthie let me stir the biscuit batter. She said I did real good." "You did," Hattie said, lifting him into her arms. "You always do." That night, after the boy had gone to bed and the house had gone still, Hattie stepped out onto the porch in her nightdress, her shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders. Travis was already there, sitting with his boots off, one leg stretched out across the boards. She sat beside him, her bare feet brushing his. The stars blinked through breaks in the cloud cover and the frogs had started up by the creek. "I've been thinking," she said. "About what?" "I want to put up a new clothesline. One big enough for more than just the three of us." He blinked once, slow. "You expecting company?" She smiled, then looked down at her hands. "I think I might be expecting more than that." He sat up straighter. "You sure?" "Not yet," she said, "but I've been tired in the mornings. Sick to my stomach some. It's different this time. Doesn't feel like something's wrong, feels like something's beginning." He didn't speak for a long moment. Then he reached for her hand and kissed the place where her fingers met her palm. "We'll build whatever comes," he said. "Together." She leaned into him, resting her temple against his shoulder. "I believe you." They married 3 days later beneath the cottonwood near the barn, with Ruthie and her husband standing witness and Tobias holding a handful of wildflowers. Hattie wore a dress she'd mended herself, and Travis had shaved clean for the first time in years. There was no preacher, just a paper signed and hands held tight, their vows spoken plain and low under the open sky. Afterward, they shared cornbread and stew with the neighbors, and Tobias fell asleep in his mother's lap as the sun dipped behind the ridge. The seasons turned. Hattie's belly grew round with child, and Tobias learned his letters by watching her trace them in the dirt. Travis built a second crib with his own hands, sanding the edges until they were smooth as river stone. At night, they often sat on the porch, listening to the wind move through the grass. She'd rest her feet in his lap, and he'd rub the aches from her calves. They didn't always speak, but they didn't need to. Come spring, she gave birth to a girl with dark hair and a steady gaze. They named her Clara Ruth, after Hattie's mother and the neighbor who'd stood by them. Travis held the baby in the crook of his arm that first night, his other hand wrapped around Hattie's. The lamp burned low, casting shadows across the wooden floor. "I never knew peace could feel like this," she whispered. He looked down at her, his voice rough with quiet. "You brought it with you." They lived on that land for the rest of their days. The barn never did fall, and the fences held. The children grew strong and kind, and the house filled with the sound of laughter and pots clanging at supper and boots on the floorboards. And through all of it, through every storm and every sunrise, Hattie and Travis stayed steady side by side, hand in hand, loving one another with a quiet, enduring fire that never once burned out.